The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of northern Arizona as Sarah Mitchell guided her horse through the narrow canyon pass. She had no idea that within the next hour, a single act of courage would change not only her life, but forge an alliance that would echo through generations. What started as a routine supply run to the remote trading post would become a story of honor, gratitude, and the unbreakable bonds formed between two worlds that rarely intersected in 1887. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always been different from the other women in Copper Ridge. At 24, she possessed a fierce independence that both impressed and worried the townspeople. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, had been a respected horse trader before his death 3 years prior, and Sarah had inherited not only his business, acumen, but his deep respect for the land and its original inhabitants. Unlike many settlers who viewed the Apache with suspicion and fear, Sarah had learned from her father that survival in this harsh country often depended on understanding rather than hostility. The October morning had started like any other. Sarah loaded her pack horse with supplies destined for Jake Harrison's trading post, a full day's ride through some of the most challenging terrain in the territory. The post served as a crucial link between the scattered ranches and the growing town of Copper Ridge, and Sarah's monthly supply runs had become an essential service that few others were willing or able to provide. The route to Harrison's post wound through a series of interconnected canyons and mesas, terrain that demanded both skill and courage to navigate. Sarah knew every rock formation, every hidden spring, and every potential danger along the trail. Her father had taught her to read the land like a book, understanding the subtle signs that warned of flash floods, unstable ground, or the presence of predators. As she guided her mare, Luna, through the familiar landscape, Sarah noticed the unusual silence that had settled over the canyon. The typical chorus of birds was absent, and even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted. Her father had taught her that silence in the wilderness was rarely a good sign, and she found herself scanning the rocky walls above with increased vigilance. The first sign of trouble came as a distant sound echoing off the canyon walls. At first, Sarah couldn't identify what she was hearing, but as Luna's ears pricked forward and the horse began to show signs of agitation, she realized she was listening to the unmistakable sound of wolves. The hunting calls were coming from somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend in the trail. Sarah's pulse quickened as she considered her options. She could turn back and take the longer route around Eagle Mesa, adding several hours to her journey. Or she could proceed cautiously and investigate the source of the commotion. Her practical nature told her to retreat, but something in the tone of the wolf calls suggested this wasn't a typical hunt. There was an urgency, an aggressive persistence that spoke of a prolonged chase. Making her decision, Sarah dismounted and secured both horses behind a large boulder formation. She pulled her Winchester rifle from its scabbard and checked the ammunition, then began making her way forward on foot, using the rocky terrain for cover. The wolf calls were growing louder now, mixed with other sounds that made her blood run cold. As she rounded a massive sandstone outcropping, the scene before her made her heart race. In a small clearing surrounded by steep rock walls, a young Apache boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, had taken refuge on top of a precariously balanced boulder. Below him, a pack of 6 wolves circled with deadly patience, their yellow eyes fixed on their trapped prey. The boy appeared to be injured, favoring his left leg, and Sarah could see blood on his torn clothing. His horse was nowhere to be seen, likely having bolted during the initial attack. What struck Sarah most was the boy's composure. Despite his desperate situation, he remained calm and alert, occasionally using a long stick to ward off any wolf that attempted to climb toward his position. Sarah quickly assessed the situation. The wolves were focused entirely on the boy, creating an opportunity for her to act without being detected. She positioned herself behind a cluster of rocks that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the clearing. The distance was approximately 60 yards, well within her effective range. Taking careful aim at the largest wolf, clearly the pack leader, Sarah steadied her breathing and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the canyon, and the wolf dropped instantly. The remaining pack members scattered in confusion, unsure of where the threat had originated. Without hesitation, Sarah worked the rifle's lever action and fired again, taking down a second wolf that had hesitated a moment too long. The remaining 4 wolves, now understanding they faced a new and deadly threat, abandoned their quarry and disappeared into the rocky maze of the canyon. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by Sarah's footsteps as she approached the boulder where the boy remained perched. He watched her approach with a mixture of wariness and gratitude, his dark eyes taking in every detail of his unexpected rescuer. "It's safe now," Sarah called out in English, then repeated the message in the few Apache words she had learned from traders who passed through Copper Ridge. The boy nodded his understanding and carefully climbed down from his rocky refuge. As he reached the ground, Sarah could see the extent of his injuries. Deep scratches marked his arms and legs, and he was clearly in pain from what appeared to be a twisted ankle. His clothes, traditional Apache garments mixed with some traded items, were torn and bloodied from his ordeal. Despite his youth, the boy carried himself with a dignity that impressed Sarah. He made no complaint about his injuries and showed no fear in her presence, despite the fact that relations between Apaches and white settlers were often tense in this region. Sarah approached slowly, her rifle lowered but ready, and gestured toward his injuries. The boy understood her concern and nodded his consent. She had learned basic first aid from her father, who had often treated injured travelers and ranch hands, and she always carried medical supplies in her saddlebags. "I need to get my supplies," she said, pointing back toward where she had left. "The horses." The boy nodded again and followed her, his limp making progress slow but manageable. When they reached Luna and the pack horse, Sarah was relieved to find both animals calm and secure. She retrieved her medical kit and a canteen of water, then guided the boy to a shaded area where she could better examine his wounds. The cuts were deep but clean, apparently made by wolf claws rather than teeth, which was fortunate. Sarah cleaned each wound carefully with water and applied a healing salve that her father had taught her to make from local plants. The boy endured the treatment without complaint, watching her work with curious interest. As she tended to his twisted ankle, Sarah found herself impressed by the boy's stoic demeanor. She had encountered Apache traders and travelers before, but never in circumstances like these. The boy's composure under stress and his obvious intelligence were remarkable for someone so young. When she finished treating his injuries, Sarah offered him water and some dried meat from her supplies. The boy accepted gratefully but sparingly, taking only what he needed. Through gestures and the few Apache words she knew, Sarah tried to determine where he had come from and where he needed to go. The boy pointed toward the eastern rim of the canyon, in the direction of the mountain ranges where several Apache bands were known to make their camps. The distance was considerable, especially for someone on foot with injuries, and Sarah realized that getting him safely home would require careful planning. What concerned her most was the boy's missing horse. In Apache culture, she knew, a horse was more than just transportation. It was a symbol of wealth and status, often representing years of careful trading and training. The loss of his mount would be a serious matter for the boy and his family. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sarah made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. She couldn't simply point the boy in the right direction and send him on his way. His injuries, the distance to his home, and the presence of wolves in the area made such a course both dangerous and irresponsible. Instead, she would escort him to the edge of Apache territory, ensuring his safe return to his people. It would mean delaying her supply run to Harrison's post, possibly by several days, but Sarah had been raised to believe that human life took precedence over commercial obligations. The boy seemed to understand her intentions and nodded his agreement to her plan. Sarah helped him mount Luna, while she led both horses on foot, setting a pace that wouldn't aggravate his injuries. They made their way out of the canyon system, heading toward the higher elevations where the air was clearer and the risk of encountering more wolves was reduced. As they traveled, Sarah found herself studying her young companion. Despite his injuries and the traumatic experience with the wolves, he remained alert to their surroundings, occasionally pointing out animal tracks or weather signs that Sarah might have missed. His knowledge of the terrain was impressive, and she realized he was far more than just a lost child. He was clearly being trained in the traditional skills of his people. The boy's name, she learned through careful communication, was something that sounded like Nalnish in Apache, though Sarah wasn't certain of the pronunciation. In return, she pointed to herself and said Sarah, which the boy repeated with careful attention to the unfamiliar sounds. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered alcove that provided protection from the wind and concealment from any potential threats. Sarah built a small fire using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke, another skill her father had taught her during their travels through Indian country. Over a simple meal of dried meat, hardtack, and coffee, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's events. The rescue had been instinctive, requiring no thought or consideration of consequences. But now, as she watched Nalnish tend to the fire with practiced skill, she began to understand that she had become part of something larger than a simple act of mercy. The boy's calm acceptance of her help, his obvious intelligence, and the careful way he observed everything around him suggested that he was no ordinary Apache youth. There was something about his bearing, a natural authority that seemed unusual for someone so young that made Sarah suspect he might come from an important family within his band. As the fire died down to glowing embers and the desert night settled around them, Sarah realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Getting Nalnish safely home was only the beginning. The real question was, what would happen when she delivered him to his people, and whether her act of mercy would be viewed as kindness or unwanted interference by the Apache leaders. What Sarah couldn't know, as she settled down for the night, with her rifle close at hand, was that the boy she had saved was the grandson of Red Cloud Walker, one of the most respected war chiefs in the region. Nor could she anticipate that her simple act of courage would set in motion events that would test the boundaries between two very different worlds, ultimately leading to a dawn encounter that would become legend in both Apache oral tradition and the scattered settlements of the Arizona Territory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The second day of their journey began before dawn, when Sarah woke to find Nalnish already awake, studying the eastern horizon with intense concentration. The boy's ability to read the subtle signs of approaching weather impressed her. Dark clouds were indeed gathering beyond the distant peaks, promising afternoon thunderstorms that could make travel treacherous in the higher elevations. Sarah broke camp efficiently, noting how Nalnish anticipated her needs, handing her items before she asked and helping secure the pack without being told. His injuries from the wolf attack were healing well, though he still favored his left ankle. When walking, more importantly, his natural leadership qualities were becoming increasingly apparent through small gestures and the way he carried himself despite his youth. They ascended through terrain that grew progressively more challenging, following ancient game trails that wound between towering rock formations and across exposed ridges. Nalnish proved invaluable as a guide, pointing out shortcuts and hazards that would have taken Sarah hours to discover on her own. His knowledge of the land went far beyond what she would have expected from someone his age, suggesting extensive training in traditional Apache woodcraft. By mid-morning, they encountered their first significant obstacle. A recent rockslide had blocked the main trail, forcing them to find an alternate route through a series of narrow ledges that skirted a deep canyon. The path was barely wide enough for the horses, with loose shale that shifted dangerously underfoot. Sarah dismounted and led Luna carefully along the treacherous route, while Nalnish, despite his injured ankle, scouted ahead to identify the safest footing. His sure-footedness in the difficult terrain reminded Sarah that Apache children learned to navigate such landscapes almost before they could walk properly. Halfway across the most dangerous section, Luna suddenly shied at a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a boulder. The horse's reaction sent loose rocks cascading into the canyon below, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought they might lose their footing entirely. Nalnish reacted instantly, grabbing Luna's bridle and speaking softly in Apache, his calm voice somehow reaching through the animal's panic. The crisis passed, but the incident highlighted their vulnerability. They were now deep in territory where a single mistake could prove fatal, and Sarah realized she was completely dependent on Nalnish's expertise to navigate safely through his people's homeland. As they progressed deeper into the mountains, the landscape revealed evidence of Apache presence, subtle markers that would have been invisible to most white travelers. Carefully arranged stones that served as directional indicators, modified trees that marked territorial boundaries, and hidden water sources that had sustained the Apache people for generations. Nalnish began to relax as they entered more familiar territory, and Sarah noticed his behavior changing. He moved with increased confidence, occasionally making soft calls that mimicked bird songs. She realized he was announcing their presence to any Apache scouts who might be watching from concealed positions among the rocks. The response came sooner than Sarah expected. As they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, 3 Apache warriors materialized from behind boulders where they had been completely invisible moments before. Their sudden appearance startled Sarah, but Nalnish showed no surprise, suggesting he had been aware of their presence for some time. The warriors were young men, probably in their 20s, armed with traditional weapons and modern rifles acquired through trade. Their faces showed immediate concern when they recognized Nalnish, followed by suspicion as they assessed Sarah's presence. A rapid conversation in Apache ensued, with Nalnish apparently explaining the circumstances of their meeting. Sarah remained mounted on Luna, keeping her hands visible and away from her rifle, understanding that any sudden movement could be interpreted as hostile. The tension in the air was palpable as the warriors debated among themselves, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions that ranged from curiosity to distrust. Finally, the eldest of the 3 warriors, a man with distinctive scars on his left cheek, approached Sarah directly. His English was limited but functional, learned through contact with traders and military personnel over the years. "You help, boy?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with intelligence. "Yes," Sarah replied simply. "Wolves. I helped him." The warrior studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Nalnish for confirmation. The boy's animated response seemed to carry great weight, and Sarah caught several references to grandfather in his rapid Apache speech. The mention of a grandfather triggered an immediate change in the warrior's demeanor. They exchanged meaningful glances, and the scarred warrior's expression became more respectful, though still cautious. Sarah sensed that Nalnish's family connections carried significant importance within the Apache community, more than she had initially realized. After additional discussion, the warriors reached a decision. 2 would escort Nalnish and Sarah to their destination, while the third would ride ahead to announce their approach. The arrangement suggested protocols for handling visitors to Apache territory, indicating a sophisticated social structure that contradicted the stereotypes held by many white settlers. The journey resumed with the Apache escort, and Sarah found herself observing the subtle interactions between Nalnish and the warriors. Despite his youth, they treated him with a deference that spoke of high status within the tribal hierarchy. Their protective attitude toward him and their careful attention to his comfort during travel reinforced Sarah's growing suspicion that she had rescued someone of considerable importance. As afternoon approached, the threatened storms materialized with typical desert suddenness. Lightning began crackling among the peaks, and the smell of rain carried on the wind promised a serious downpour. The Apache warriors quickly led them to a natural shelter, a deep overhang in the canyon wall that had obviously been used for generations as a temporary refuge. While they waited out the storm, Sarah had her first real opportunity to observe Apache culture in a natural setting. The warriors shared their food without ceremony, treating her inclusion as a matter of simple hospitality rather than unusual generosity. Their conversation, conducted in low tones, included frequent references to current events within their community that she couldn't understand, but found fascinating to observe. Nalnish served as an informal translator, explaining some of the cultural nuances that might help Sarah avoid inadvertent offense during their final approach to his home. She learned that direct eye contact with elders was considered disrespectful, that certain topics were inappropriate for discussion with women present, and that gift-giving followed specific protocols that had deep spiritual significance. Most importantly, Nalnish explained that her decision to help him had created a debt of honor that his family would feel obligated to acknowledge. The concept of reciprocal obligation was fundamental to Apache's social structure, and her act of mercy had initiated a formal relationship between herself and his extended family that carried both privileges and responsibilities. When the storm passed, they emerged to find the desert transformed. The rain had awakened dormant plants, filling the air with rich, earthy scents and creating temporary waterfalls that cascaded down the canyon walls. The landscape seemed more alive, more vibrant, and Sarah began to understand why the Apache people felt such a deep spiritual connection to this harsh but beautiful land. The final portion of their journey took them through a hidden valley that served as the seasonal camp for Nalnish's band. The settlement was larger than Sarah had expected, with perhaps 60 families living in traditional wickiups, arranged in a careful pattern that reflected social relationships and family hierarchies within the community. Their arrival created an immediate stir. Women emerged from their dwellings to see the unusual sight of a white woman riding peacefully alongside Apache warriors, while children gathered at a respectful distance to stare at this unprecedented visitor. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her every move, understanding that her behavior in the next few minutes would determine how she was received by the entire community. Nalnish dismounted first, moving with obvious eagerness toward a large wickiup positioned prominently at the center of the settlement. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up with relief and joy as she recognized her grandson. The reunion was emotional but restrained, conducted according to cultural protocols that emphasized dignity and self-control, even. In moments of high emotion, Sarah remained mounted, uncertain of proper etiquette, until Nalnish gestured for her to dismount and approach. The elderly woman, clearly his grandmother, studied Sarah with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her weathered hands reached out to touch Nalnish's healing wounds, and her expression became grave as she listened to his account of the wolf attack and rescue. Other family members began to gather, including several middle-aged men whose bearing suggested positions of authority within the band. Sarah recognized the family resemblance in their features and realized she was meeting the extended kinship network that formed the foundation of Apache social organization. The formal introductions followed traditional patterns that Nalnish had described during their journey. Sarah was presented first to the grandmother, then to each male relative, in order of age and status. Each introduction involved specific phrases in Apache that acknowledged her role in Nalnish's rescue and expressed gratitude for her actions. As the formal greetings concluded, Sarah became aware of increased activity throughout the camp. Messengers were departing on horseback, heading in different directions with obvious urgency. Preparations were beginning for what appeared to be a significant gathering, though the purpose remained unclear to her. The grandmother, whose name Sarah learned, was Flying Bird Woman, invited her to share the evening meal as an honored guest. The invitation was clearly a significant honor, placing Sarah under the family's protection and marking her as someone deserving of respect within the community. As evening settled over the valley, Sarah found herself seated around a fire with 3 generations of Nalnish's family. The conversation flowed between English and Apache, with various family members serving as translators to ensure she understood the essential points being discussed. What gradually became clear was that news of her rescue of Nalnish had implications far beyond simple gratitude. The boy was not merely a beloved grandson. He was the designated heir of Red Cloud Walker, one of the most influential war chiefs in the entire Apache Confederation. Her act of mercy had saved the future leader of a people who were fighting desperately to preserve their way of life against overwhelming odds. The realization struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had stumbled into the middle of a complex political situation that involved not just local Apache bands, but the broader struggle between Native Americans and the expanding United States government. Her simple act of humanity had created ripples that would extend far beyond anything she had imagined. As the fire died down and the family began to retire for the night, Flying Bird Woman took Sarah aside for a private conversation. Through careful translation provided by one of the younger family members, the elderly woman explained that Red Cloud Walker was currently away, leading a delegation to a crucial council meeting with other Apache leaders. More significantly, she revealed that messengers had already been dispatched to inform the chief of his grandson's rescue and safe return. The news would reach him within 2 days, and tradition demanded that he return immediately to personally acknowledge the debt of honor created by Sarah's actions. Flying Bird Woman's expression grew serious as she explained the cultural significance of what was about to unfold. Red Cloud Walker's response to Sarah's deed would be viewed by all Apache bands as a statement of policy regarding relations with white settlers. How he chose to honor the debt would send a message throughout the territory about Apache intentions and capabilities. Sarah spent a restless night in the guest wiki-up that had been prepared for her, processing the implications of what she had learned. What had begun as a spontaneous act of mercy was evolving into something much larger, a test case for the possibility of peaceful coexistence between 2 cultures that had been locked in conflict for generations. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Decisions made by Red Cloud Walker in response to her actions could influence the course of Apache settler relations throughout the territory. The wrong choice could escalate tensions and lead to more bloodshed, while the right approach might open possibilities for mutual understanding and respect. As dawn approached, Sarah realized that her life had been forever changed by those few moments when she chose to help a boy trapped by wolves. The consequences of that choice were still unfolding, but one thing was certain. Within days, she would face Red Cloud Walker and learn firsthand how one of the most powerful Apache leaders chose to respond to an act of unexpected kindness from An unlikely source. The third morning in the Apache camp brought an atmosphere of heightened anticipation that Sarah could feel even before she fully awakened. The usual sounds of daily life, children playing, women preparing meals, men discussing the day's activities, were subdued, replaced by an undercurrent of focused preparation that suggested something significant was approaching. Flying bird. Woman appeared at Sarah's wickiup with breakfast, and news that messengers had returned during the night. Red Cloud Walker had received word of his grandson's rescue and was already traveling back to the settlement. More importantly, he was not coming alone. The chief had dispatched runners to gather warriors from allied bands, calling in obligations and friendships that stretched across the Apache Confederation. The implications were staggering. What Sarah had assumed would be a simple meeting of gratitude was transforming into a major gathering that would draw Apache leaders from across the territory. Flying Bird Woman's expression suggested this was unprecedented. Never before had Red Cloud Walker called such an assembly to honor a debt to a white person. Throughout the morning, riders began arriving from distant camps. Sarah watched from a respectful distance as groups of warriors rode into the valley, each contingent representing different Apache bands with their own distinct traditions and territorial claims. The settlement swelled with activity as temporary. Shelters were erected and provisions organized to accommodate the growing crowd. Nalnish sought out Sarah during the preparations, his young face serious with the weight of what was unfolding. Through careful explanation, he helped her understand the significance of each arriving group. Some were longtime allies of his grandfather, bound by marriage ties and shared battles against common enemies. Others were neutral parties whose presence indicated respect for Red Cloud Walker's reputation and curiosity about the unprecedented situation. Most intriguing were the representatives from bands that had historically maintained tense relationships with Red Cloud Walker's people. Their willingness to answer his call spoke to the chief's influence and the extraordinary nature of the circumstances. Sarah realized she was witnessing a diplomatic gathering of immense complexity, all triggered by her spontaneous decision to help a boy in danger. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how the Apache people interacted with her. The initial curiosity had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of respect, speculation, and careful assessment. She was no longer simply the white woman who had helped Nalnish. She was now a central figure in an event that would influence Apache politics and inter-tribal relationships for years to come. The arrival of two hawks flying, a war chief from the northern bands, marked a turning point in the gathering's significance. Sarah learned from whispered conversations that two hawks flying rarely traveled south and had been engaged in ongoing disputes with several of the assembled leaders. His presence indicated that Red Cloud Walker's call had transcended normal political boundaries. Two hawks flying was an imposing figure, taller than most Apache men, with scars that told stories of countless battles and a bearing that commanded immediate respect. His assessment of Sarah was thorough and unsettling, his dark eyes taking in every detail as if measuring her worth against some internal standard known only to himself. The afternoon brought the arrival of White Mountain representatives, led by an elderly chief named Stone Bear, whose reputation for wisdom was legendary throughout the Apache world. Stone Bear's advanced age made travel difficult, yet he had made the arduous journey specifically to witness Red Cloud Walker's response to the unprecedented situation. Sarah found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the gravity of what was developing around her. Each new arrival raised the stakes of the coming encounter, transforming what should have been a simple expression of gratitude into a momentous event that would be remembered and discussed in Apache councils for generations. Flying Bird Woman. continued to serve as Sarah's cultural interpreter, explaining the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed interactions between the various Apache bands. The old woman's knowledge was encyclopedic, encompassing genealogies, historical grievances, alliance patterns, and ceremonial protocols that had evolved over centuries. Most importantly, Flying Bird Woman helped Sarah understand that Red Cloud, Walker's response to her actions, would be viewed as a statement of policy regarding all future Apache interactions with white settlers. If he chose to honor the debt in traditional fashion, it would signal Apache willingness to recognize and respect acts of genuine friendship from the white community. If he responded with suspicion or minimal acknowledgement, it would reinforce the barriers between the two peoples. The weight of this responsibility troubled Sarah deeply. She had never sought to become a symbol or catalyst for broader social change. Her decision to help Nalnish had been instinctive, requiring no consideration of potential consequences or political implications. Now she found herself at the center of a situation that could influence the course of history in the Arizona Territory. Evening brought word that Red Cloud Walker would arrive the following morning, accompanied by his personal guard of elite warriors. The news sent ripples of excitement and tension through the assembled crowd as final preparations began for what promised to be an extraordinary encounter. Sarah spent a restless night wrestling with anxiety about the coming meeting. Flying Bird Woman had explained the various ways Apache chiefs traditionally acknowledged significant debts of honor, ranging from formal recognition and gifts to adoption into the tribe or permanent alliance agreements. Each option carried profound implications that extended far beyond Sarah's personal situation. The fourth dawn brought a crisp mountain air that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The entire camp was awake before sunrise, engaged in final preparations for Red Cloud Walker's arrival. Sarah was provided with clean clothing and invited to participate in a purification ceremony that Flying Bird Woman insisted was necessary for anyone about to meet the great chief. The ceremony itself was surprisingly moving, involving prayers to the four directions, burning of sacred herbs, and symbolic washing that was intended to cleanse both body and spirit. Sarah participated respectfully, understanding that her willingness to engage with Apache customs was being carefully observed and would influence how she was received by the chief. As the sun cleared the eastern peaks, lookouts posted on the surrounding ridges began signaling the approach of Red Cloud Walker's party. The visual communication system was sophisticated, using mirror flashes and smoke signals to convey detailed information about the size and composition of the approaching group. The numbers were staggering. Red Cloud Walker was approaching with 60 warriors, representing not just his personal guard, but selected representatives from every major Apache band in the Confederation. The size of his escort was unprecedented for a peaceful meeting, clearly intended to demonstrate both the chief's power and the significance he attached to the coming encounter. Sarah's heart raced as she processed the implications. 60 Apache warriors accompanying their most respected leader to meet with a single white woman was an event that would be remembered and analyzed throughout the territory. The political ramifications would extend far beyond the Apache community, influencing how military commanders, territorial officials, and settler communities viewed the balance of power in the region. Flying Bird Woman appeared at Sarah's side, her weathered face grave with the weight of the moment. The elderly woman had donned her finest clothing and jewelry, transforming herself from a simple grandmother into a figure of dignity and authority suitable for receiving the great chief. Her preparations served as a reminder that this meeting involved not just Sarah, but the entire extended family that had taken responsibility for her welfare. The sound of approaching horses gradually filled the valley, accompanied by the jingling of metal ornaments and the soft conversation of men who rode with the confidence of those accustomed to command. Sarah positioned herself according to Flying Bird Woman's careful instructions, understanding that every aspect of her appearance and behavior would be scrutinized and interpreted according to Apache cultural standards. When Red Cloud Walker finally appeared at the head of his column, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The chief was not the savage warrior of frontier legends, but rather a man of obvious intelligence and dignity whose presence commanded immediate respect. His bearing spoke of natural authority tempered by wisdom, and his careful assessment of the assembled crowd demonstrated the calculated mind of a skilled political leader. The 60 warriors who accompanied him were equally impressive, representing the finest fighters and most respected leaders from across the Apache Confederation. Their disciplined formation and attentive silence spoke to Red Cloud Walker's ability to command loyalty and coordinate complex political relationships across tribal boundaries. The chief's horse was magnificent, a paint stallion whose proud bearing matched that of its rider. Red Cloud Walker's clothing combined traditional Apache elements with items acquired through trade and warfare, creating a visual statement about his people's ability to adapt and survive in a changing world while maintaining their cultural identity. The column entered the settlement proper. Sarah became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the assembled crowd. Hundreds of Apache people, representing dozens of different bands and family groups, watched in respectful attention as their most revered leader approached the site where he would address the unprecedented situation created by her actions. Red Cloudwalker dismounted with fluid grace, his movements demonstrating the physical conditioning and awareness that had made him legendary in both warfare and diplomacy. His immediate attention went to Nalnish, and Sarah witnessed a brief but profound moment of connection between grandfather and grandson that transcended the formal protocols governing the public gathering. The reunion was conducted according to Apache customs that emphasized dignity and emotional restraint, but Sarah could see the deep affection and relief in both faces. Red Cloud Walker's hands briefly touched his grandson's healing wounds, and his expression darkened momentarily as he assessed the evidence of how close he had come to losing his designated heir. When the chief finally turned his attention to Sarah, she felt the full weight of his assessment. His eyes were intelligent and penetrating, taking in every detail of her appearance, posture, and expression as he formed his initial judgment of the woman who had saved his grandson's life. The moment stretched endlessly as Sarah struggled to maintain appropriate composure under the most intense scrutiny she had ever experienced. Red Cloud Walker's first words would set the tone for everything that followed, and Sarah realized that the next few moments would determine not only her personal fate, but potentially influence the relationship between Apache people and white settlers throughout the territory. The great chief's decision about how to acknowledge her actions would reverberate through both communities for years to come. As Red Cloud Walker opened his mouth to speak, Sarah understood that she was about to become part of Apache history, willing or not. The consequences of her simple act of mercy were about to unfold in ways she could never have imagined when she first heard the sound of wolves echoing through that distant canyon. Red Cloud Walker's voice carried across the silent valley, with the authority of thunder rolling through mountain peaks. When he spoke, it was first in Apache, addressing the assembled warriors and chiefs who had answered his unprecedented call. His words flowed with the rhythm of formal oratory, each phrase carefully chosen and weighted with significance that resonated through generations of Apache tradition. Sarah stood motionless as the great chief recounted the events that had brought them all together. Though she couldn't understand the Apache language, the emotional cadence of his speech painted a vivid picture of Nalnish's ordeal and her intervention. The assembled crowd listened with the respectful attention reserved for matters of life-changing importance. When Red Cloud Walker turned to address Sarah directly, his English carried only the slightest accent, revealing an education that surprised many white settlers who had underestimated Apache intelligence and adaptability. His voice was measured, each word chosen with the precision of a diplomat who understood that every syllable would be remembered and analyzed. "Sarah Mitchell," he began, and hearing her full name spoken by the legendary war chief sent chills down her spine. "You saved the life of my grandson when the wolf pack would have taken him from us. This debt cannot be repaid with simple words or gifts. What you have done requires an answer that honors both your courage and our traditions." The chief paused, allowing his words to settle over the crowd like morning mist settling into canyon depths. Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, understanding that this moment would define not only her future, but potentially alter the relationship between two worlds that had been locked in suspicion and conflict. Red Cloud Walker raised. His hand and two hawks flying stepped forward, carrying an ornate buffalo hide bundle that had clearly been prepared with great ceremony. The northern chief's movements were precise and ritualistic, suggesting this was part of a formal protocol that carried deep cultural significance. "In our tradition," Red Cloud Walker continued, "when someone saves the life of a chief's heir, they become part of our family, not through marriage or adoption, but through a bond of honor that transcends the usual boundaries between peoples. Today, before all these witnesses, I name you Sister Who Fights Wolves, and you will be known by this name among all Apache bands as long as our people remember stories around the fire." The formal naming ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. Each of the assembled chiefs stepped forward to acknowledge her new status, speaking her Apache name with the reverence reserved for individuals who had earned their place in tribal history through extraordinary deeds. Stone Bear, the elderly, chief from the White Mountain bands, approached with surprising vigor despite his advanced years. His weathered hands placed a beautifully crafted silver bracelet on Sarah's wrist, explaining in careful English that it had belonged to his own daughter, killed in a cavalry raid 15 years earlier. She would have been proud to see her bracelet. "Worn by another woman of courage," Stone Bear said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The gesture represented more than simple gift-giving. It was a profound statement of acceptance that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Two hawks flying presented her with a knife whose blade had been forged from meteoric iron, its handle carved with symbols representing protection and wisdom. The weapon was not merely functional but spiritual, imbued with power that Apache warriors believed could turn aside evil and guide its bearer through dangerous situations. Each gift carried layers of meaning that Flying Bird Woman would later explain, but even without full understanding, Sarah recognized she was receiving treasures that represented generations of Apache craftsmanship and spiritual belief. The honor was overwhelming, humbling her in ways she had never experienced. Red Cloud Walker then made an announcement that stunned even the Apache leadership. Sarah would be granted safe passage throughout all Apache territory, marked by a special token that would be recognized by every band in the Confederation. More significantly, she would have the right to call upon Apache protection if threatened, a privilege extended to fewer than a dozen white people in the entire history of their interactions. The implications were staggering. Sarah realized she was being offered something unprecedented, genuine acceptance into a community that had every reason to view her people as enemies. The trust represented by such an offer was both deeply moving and terrifying in its responsibilities. But Red Cloud Walker was not finished. His next words would create ripples that extended far beyond the Apache community, reaching into the offices of territorial officials and military commanders throughout Arizona. "Tomorrow," the chief declared, 60 of our finest warriors will escort Sister Who Fights Wolves safely back to her people. This escort will serve as a message to all who see it. The Apache Nation honors its debts and protects those who have shown genuine friendship to our children." The proposed escort created an immediate stir among the assembled chiefs. 60 Apache warriors riding openly through settled territory would be interpreted as either a gesture of unprecedented goodwill or a potential threat, depending on the perspective of those who witnessed it. The political ramifications could influence territorial policy for years to come. Sarah understood the magnitude of what was being offered and the risks involved for everyone concerned. Apache warriors traveling through white settlements would be vulnerable to attack from fearful or hostile settlers, while their presence might provoke military responses that could escalate into broader conflict. "Great Chief," Sarah said, finding her voice despite the enormous pressure of the moment, "I am deeply honored by your offer, but I fear such an escort might be misunderstood by my people. They might see 60 warriors as a threat rather than a gesture of friendship." Red Cloud Walker's eyes showed approval at her diplomatic response, recognizing both courage and wisdom in her willingness to speak honestly about potential complications. His slight nod indicated respect for her consideration of broader consequences rather than simple acceptance of personal honor. "Your words show the wisdom that guided you to save my grandson," the chief replied, "but the escort will proceed as planned. It is time for your people to understand that Apache honor is not something to be feared, but respected. Those who see our warriors will know that we are capable of both war and peace, and we choose our path based on how we are treated." The conversation that followed involved the assembled chiefs in a complex discussion of logistics, protocols, and potential responses to various scenarios they might encounter during the escort journey. Sarah listened with growing amazement to the sophistication of their planning, which took into account everything from weather patterns to the likely reactions of specific military units stationed throughout the territory. What emerged was not the impulsive gesture of warriors seeking glory, but a carefully calculated diplomatic initiative designed to demonstrate Apache strength while emphasizing their commitment to honoring legitimate debts of gratitude. The escort would travel openly, following established roads rather than hidden trails, making their peaceful intentions clear to any observer. As evening approached, Red Cloud Walker invited Sarah to share the evening meal with the assembled leadership, an honor that placed her at the very center of Apache political discourse. The conversation around the fire ranged across topics that revealed the depth and complexity of Apache concerns about their future in a rapidly changing world. The chiefs discussed not only immediate tactical considerations, but long-term strategic questions about how their people could maintain cultural identity while adapting to the realities of American expansion. Sarah found herself witnessing discussions that few white people had ever been privileged to observe, gaining insights into Apache perspectives that challenged many assumptions held by settler communities. Most striking was the pragmatic realism that characterized their analysis. These were not the savage warriors of frontier mythology, but thoughtful leaders grappling with impossible choices while trying to ensure their people's survival. Their willingness to include her in such sensitive discussions spoke to the genuine acceptance her actions had earned. As the formal discussions concluded, Red Cloud Walker approached Sarah for a private conversation that would remain between them. His words, spoken in the flickering light of the dying fire, carried a gravity that made clear this was the real purpose of the entire gathering. "Sister Who Fights Wolves," he said, using her Apache name with casual familiarity, "you have seen tonight how our people think and plan. You understand now that we are not the mindless enemies your newspapers describe. When you return to your people, you will carry knowledge that could help both our communities find a path toward mutual respect." The responsibility he was placing on her shoulders was enormous. Sarah realized she was being asked to serve as an informal ambassador, using her unique position to influence white attitudes toward Apache people and their legitimate concerns about survival in their ancestral homeland. Red Cloud Walker continued, his voice taking on the cadence of prophecy. "The time is coming when our peoples must choose between endless war or finding ways to live as neighbors. Your courage in saving Nalnish has opened a door that has been closed for too many years. What happens next depends on whether others, on both sides, have the wisdom to walk through it." The weight of his words settled over Sarah, like a mantle of responsibility she had never sought but could not refuse. Her simple act of mercy had indeed changed everything, creating possibilities that had not existed before, while placing her at the center of forces much larger than herself. As she prepared for sleep in the honored guest quarters, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her life over the past few days. She had entered Apache territory as an unknown settler woman and would leave as a recognized member of their extended family, carrying responsibilities and privileges that would influence her relationships with both communities for the rest of her life. The next morning brought the final ceremony as 60 warriors prepared for the journey that would escort her home. Each warrior had been carefully selected not only for his fighting skills, but for his ability to represent Apache dignity and discipline under potentially provocative circumstances. Red Cloud Walker personally supervised the preparations, ensuring that weapons were displayed openly but non-threateningly, that the warriors' appearance would command respect rather than fear, and that their conduct would reflect the honor of all Apache people. As Sarah mounted Luna for the return journey, she looked back at the settlement that had become a second home in ways she was only beginning to understand. Nalnish stood beside his grandfather, his young face serious with the knowledge that he too had been changed by their encounter with the wolves and its extraordinary aftermath. The escort formed around her with military precision 60 warriors, whose presence would announce to everyone they encountered that Apache people were capable of both terrible war and profound honor, and that their choice between these paths would depend on how they were treated by those they met. As they rode out of the valley toward the wider world beyond, Sarah understood that she was no longer simply Sarah Mitchell, horse trader from Copper Ridge. She was now Sister Who Fights Wolves, carrying the hopes and expectations of two very different communities toward a future that neither could predict, but both desperately needed to navigate together. The escort would create a sensation throughout the territory, forcing conversations about Apache capabilities and intentions that had been avoided for too long. Whether those conversations would lead toward mutual understanding or deeper conflict would depend on the wisdom and courage of leaders in both communities, and on Sarah's ability to bridge two worlds that had been kept apart by fear and misunderstanding. For far too long, the morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Sarah's extraordinary escort began their historic journey toward Copper Ridge. The 60 Apache warriors rode in formation that spoke of military precision and cultural pride, their disciplined ranks creating a spectacle that would be remembered by anyone fortunate enough to witness it. Leading the procession was Thunderhorse, Red Cloud Walker's most trusted war captain, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his diplomatic skills. The chief had chosen him specifically for this mission, understanding that the success of their unprecedented gesture would depend as much on careful management of encounters with white settlers as on the warriors' ability to project strength and dignity. The route they followed had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. Rather than taking the direct path through isolated canyons and mountain passes, the escort would travel along established roads and through populated areas, ensuring maximum visibility for their peaceful mission. Every settlement, ranch, and military outpost along the way would witness the remarkable sight of Apache warriors traveling openly in a gesture of honor rather than stealth. Sarah rode at the center of the formation, protected by warriors whose loyalty to Red Cloud Walker had been proven in countless battles. The position was both an honor and a responsibility, marking her as someone under Apache protection while making her the focal point of an event that would reshape territorial understanding of Apache capabilities and intentions. The first test of their mission came sooner than expected. As they crested a ridge overlooking the Gila River Valley, smoke signals began appearing on distant peaks. Apache scouts reporting the movement of the unusual party to other bands throughout the region. The communication network was sophisticated and rapid, ensuring that news of their passage would spread across Apache territory within hours. Thunderhorse interpreted the signals for Sarah, explaining that the messages contained not just information about their location and direction, but detailed descriptions of their peaceful nature and diplomatic purpose. The Apache communication system was carrying the story of her rescue of Nalnish and the subsequent honor ceremony to bands that had not been present at Red Cloud Walker's gathering. More significantly, the signals were coordinating responses from various Apache groups to ensure safe passage for the escort. Warrior bands that might normally challenge such a large military formation were being instructed to observe rather than intercept, while friendly groups were positioning themselves to provide assistance if needed. The sophistication of this coordination impressed Sarah deeply. She was witnessing firsthand the organizational capabilities that had allowed Apache people to resist American expansion for decades. Understanding now why military commanders had found them such formidable opponents despite being vastly outnumbered. As they descended toward the river crossing, the escort encountered their first white settlers, a family of homesteaders whose small ranch occupied a strategic position along the main road. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The settlers abandoned their work and retreated to their fortified cabin, weapons visible in every window. Thunderhorse called a halt at a respectful distance from the ranch buildings, then approached alone with his hands visible and empty. His English was excellent, learned through years of interaction with traders and military personnel, and his manner conveyed both strength and peaceful intentions. "We travel in peace," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the tents. Silence. "We escort the woman who saved the grandson of Red Cloud Walker. We mean no harm to your family or your property." The standoff stretched for several minutes as the homesteaders processed this unprecedented situation. Never before had Apache warriors announced their presence openly or explained their peaceful intentions to white settlers. The usual pattern involved either stealth and ambush or formal military engagements with clear battle lines. Eventually, the ranch owner emerged from his cabin, rifle held ready but not directly threatening. His face showed the mixture of fear and curiosity that characterized most settler reactions to Apache presence. The conversation that followed would be repeated dozens of times as the escort made its way toward Copper Ridge. "You say you're escorting a white woman?" the rancher asked, his voice tight with tension. Sarah urged Luna forward, understanding that her presence was the key to diffusing the situation. The sight of her riding peacefully among Apache warriors, clearly unharmed and apparently honored rather than captive, created cognitive dissonance that challenged every stereotype the settlers held about Apache behavior. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from Copper Ridge," she called out. "These warriors are escorting me home after I helped one of their children. They mean no harm to anyone." The explanation required careful elaboration as Thunder Horse and Sarah worked together to help the homesteaders understand the cultural significance of what they were witnessing. The concept of Apache honorettes was foreign to most white settlers, who had been conditioned to view all Apache actions through the lens of potential threat. What emerged from this first encounter was a pattern that would repeat throughout their journey. Initial fear and suspicion gradually gave way to amazement and cautious respect, as settlers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of Apache-white relations. The ranch family eventually offered water for the horses and basic supplies for the journey, gestures of hospitality that Thunder Horse accepted with formal courtesy. The exchange was carefully managed to demonstrate that Apache warriors could interact peacefully with settler families when mutual respect was maintained. As they prepared to resume their journey, the rancher's teenage son approached Sarah with obvious curiosity. His questions revealed the depth of misinformation that circulated in settler communities about Apache people and their motivations. "Are they really going to let you go free?" the boy asked, unable to comprehend that she was traveling as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. Sarah's response became a template for explaining the cultural context of her situation to confused and frightened settlers throughout their journey. She described the rescue of Nalnish, the honor ceremony, and the debt of gratitude that Apache tradition required Red Cloud Walker to acknowledge. More importantly, she began to convey her growing understanding of Apache society as something far more complex and sophisticated than the savage stereotypes promoted by territorial newspapers and military reports. Her first-hand account of Apache hospitality, wisdom, and genuine concern for their people's survival challenged assumptions that had justified decades of hostile policy. The escort resumed their journey with renewed confidence, having successfully navigated their first encounter with white settlers. The pattern established at the ranch would serve them well as they encountered increasingly complex situations on the road to Copper Ridge. Their next significant challenge came at the military checkpoint near Fort McDowell, where a patrol of cavalry troopers had been positioned to monitor traffic along the main road. The sight of 60 Apache warriors approaching in formation triggered immediate alarm, with soldiers scrambling to defensive positions and signal flags calling for reinforcements. Thunder Horse again took the lead in managing the encounter, but this situation required more delicate handling than the ranch confrontation. Military personnel were trained to view Apache warriors as enemy combatants, and their protocols allowed for aggressive response to perceived threats. The patrol leader, Lieutenant James Crawford, was a young officer whose experience with Apache warfare had been limited to brief skirmishes and second-hand reports. His initial reaction was to demand that the Apache formation halt and identify their intentions, while positioning his men for potential combat. Sarah understood that this encounter could easily escalate into violence if not handled with extreme care. Both sides were armed and trained for conflict, and a single misunderstanding could trigger a firefight that would destroy everything Red Cloud Walker had hoped to accomplish. "Lieutenant Crawford," she called out, riding forward to place herself between the two forces. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, a citizen of this territory. These warriors are providing me with safe escort home after I assisted their people. We request permission to pass peacefully." The military encounter required extensive explanation and verification before Lieutenant Crawford could accept the unprecedented situation. Sarah's credentials as a legitimate territorial citizen were beyond question, but the presence of her Apache escort challenged every assumption in military protocol. The resolution came when Thunder Horse produced a formal letter written in English by Red Cloud Walker himself, explaining the circumstances of Sarah's rescue of his grandson and the honor debt that required Apache protection for her journey home. The letter was a masterpiece of diplomacy, acknowledging military authority while asserting Apache rights to travel peacefully through their ancestral territory. Lieutenant Crawford's response revealed the complexity of military attitudes toward Apache people. While trained to view them as enemies, professional soldiers could recognize and respect military capability and discipline when they encountered it. The escort's obvious organization and restraint impressed the cavalry troopers, who had rarely seen Apache warriors in non-combat situations. The negotiation that followed established protocols for the escort's continued journey, including agreements about road usage, camp locations, and procedures for identifying themselves to other military units they might encounter. The arrangements represented unprecedented cooperation between Apache leaders and territorial military authority. As they departed the checkpoint, Sarah realized she had witnessed something historic. For the first time in decades, Apache warriors and American soldiers had negotiated peacefully, finding common ground based on mutual respect rather than fear and hostility. The success of these early encounters gave the escort confidence as they approached more populated areas. Word of their passage was spreading ahead of them through both Apache and settler communication networks, creating anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. At the town of Globe, they encountered their most complex challenge yet. The mining community had suffered Apache raids in recent years, and local sentiment was strongly hostile toward any Apache presence. The arrival of 60 warriors, even under peaceful circumstances, triggered immediate alarm and demands for military intervention. Town. Marshal Pete Sullivan was a pragmatic man whose survival had depended on his ability to read dangerous situations accurately. The escort's disciplined appearance and obvious peaceful intentions impressed him, but he faced pressure from frightened citizens who demanded protection from what they perceived as an invasion. Sarah found herself serving as an unofficial diplomat, explaining repeatedly the circumstances that had led to her Apache escort, while trying to calm fears that were rooted in years of conflict and misunderstanding. Her status as a known citizen of the territory gave her credibility, but overcoming ingrained prejudices required patience and persistence. The turning point came when several respected townspeople stepped forward to vouch for Sarah's character and reliability. Her reputation as an honest trader who had dealt fairly with everyone, including Apache customers, provided the foundation for trust that allowed rational discussion of the unprecedented situation. Thunderhorse contributed to the resolution by agreeing to camp outside town limits rather than requesting accommodation within Globe itself. The gesture demonstrated Apache willingness to respect local concerns, while maintaining their mission to escort Sarah safely home. The evening spent near Globe became an impromptu cultural exchange as curious townspeople overcame their initial fears to observe Apache customs and craftsmanship. Several merchants recognized the quality of Apache metalwork and leather goods, leading to discussions about potential trading relationships that could benefit both communities. For Sarah, the Globe encounter illustrated the possibility of changing attitudes through direct contact and honest communication. Fear and hostility began to give way to curiosity and cautious respect when people had the opportunity to interact with Apache individuals rather than stereotypes. As they prepared to resume their journey toward Copper Ridge, Sarah reflected on the transformation she was witnessing. Each successful encounter was breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable, creating opportunities for understanding that had not existed before her rescue of Nalnish. The escort's journey was becoming more than a simple gesture of honor. It was evolving into a demonstration of how two very different cultures might find ways to coexist with mutual respect rather than endless conflict. The success of their mission would depend on whether the lessons learned along the road could be sustained when they reached their final destination. The final day of their journey dawned with an autumn crispness that carried the promise of winter in the high country. As the escort crested the last ridge before Copper Ridge, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had been building since they left Red Cloud Walker's camp. The town spread below them in the valley, its familiar buildings and streets, now seeming somehow different after her transformative experience in the Apache world. Thunderhorse called a halt to assess the situation before their dramatic arrival. Smoke was rising from multiple chimneys, indicating normal daily activity, but the war captain's experienced eye noted subtle signs of preparation that suggested word of their approach had already reached the settlement. Strategic positions on rooftops showed movement, and the main street appeared unusually empty for mid-morning. "Your people know we are coming," Thunderhorse observed, his tone neutral but alert. "They prepare for trouble, though we bring none." Sarah studied her hometown with new eyes, understanding for the first time how Apache visitors must perceive the defensive arrangements that settlers considered normal precautions. The fortified buildings, elevated firing positions, and clear fields of fire that provided security for the residents would appear threatening and hostile to anyone approaching peacefully. The escort began their descent into the valley with heightened awareness, every warrior understanding that their conduct in the next few hours would determine whether their mission ended in triumph or tragedy. The stakes had grown beyond simple honor fulfillment. They were now demonstrating Apache capability for peaceful coexistence to an audience that included territorial officials, military commanders, and influential citizens whose opinions would shape policy for years to come. As they entered the outskirts of Copper Ridge, the first residents began appearing at windows and doorways. The sight of 60 Apache warriors escorting a single white woman through their streets created a sensation that brought the entire community to a standstill. Sarah recognized familiar faces among the observers, people she had known and traded with for years, now viewing her with mixtures of amazement, concern, and incomprehension. Mayor William Hendricks emerged from the town hall accompanied by Sheriff Tom Bradley and several prominent citizens. The official reception committee had clearly been hastily assembled, but their presence demonstrated that community leaders were taking the unprecedented situation seriously rather than simply reacting with fear or hostility. Thunderhorse guided the escort to a respectful halt in the town square, positioning the warriors in a formation that projected dignity and strength while remaining clearly non-threatening. The Apache leader dismounted and approached the mayor. With the same diplomatic courtesy he had shown at every encounter during their journey, "We bring Sarah Mitchell safely home," Thunderhorse announced, his voice carrying clearly across the tense square. "Red Cloud Walker sends greetings to the people of Copper Ridge and honors the debt created when this woman saved his grandson from death." Mayor Hendricks was a practical politician who had learned to navigate the complex realities of territorial life. His response would be carefully watched by every resident of the town and reported throughout the territory. The precedent established in Copper Ridge would influence how other communities handled similar situations in the future. "We welcome Sarah home and thank you for ensuring her safe return," the mayor replied, his diplomatic training evident in the careful neutrality of his words. "The people of Copper Ridge appreciate the honor you have shown our citizen." The formal exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Marcus Stone, commanding officer of the military detachment stationed near Copper Ridge. His presence complicated the situation significantly, as military protocols for handling Apache warriors differed sharply from civilian approaches to diplomatic encounters. Captain Stone's assessment of the situation was thorough and professional, taking in the escort's obvious discipline, their non-aggressive positioning, and the remarkable fact that they had traveled openly through settled territory without incident. His military experience allowed him to recognize and respect the tactical skill required to move 60 warriors through hostile territory while maintaining peaceful intentions. "Thunderhorse," the captain said, using the war leader's name with the respect due a worthy opponent. "Your reputation precedes you. I'm curious about the circumstances that bring you to Copper Ridge in peace rather than war." The conversation that followed became an impromptu negotiation between military and Apache leadership, with Sarah serving as both catalyst and translator for cultural nuances that neither side fully understood. The dialogue revealed sophisticated thinking on both sides about the possibilities and limitations of peaceful coexistence. Thunderhorse explained the cultural significance of honor debts in Apache society, emphasizing that Red Cloud Walker's response to Sarah's kindness represented a fundamental principle that governed Apache relationships with all peoples. The escort was not merely a gesture of gratitude, but a demonstration of Apache commitment to reciprocal respect and justice. Captain Stone's response revealed the military's growing recognition that Apache resistance could not be defeated through force alone. Professional soldiers were beginning to understand that political solutions might be more effective than continued warfare, especially when dealing with leaders who demonstrated both military capability and diplomatic sophistication. The breakthrough came when Sarah herself stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. Her words would be remembered and quoted throughout the territory, becoming part of the legendary account of her extraordinary journey. "People of Copper Ridge," she began, her voice carrying the authority earned through her recent experiences. "I stand before you today not as a captive who has been returned, but as someone who has been honored by a great people. The Apache warriors who escort me are not our enemies unless we choose to make them so. They are fathers and sons, brothers and husbands who love their families and their land as much as we love ours." Her speech continued with detailed accounts of Apache hospitality, wisdom, and genuine desire for peaceful coexistence when treated with respect and fairness. Sarah's first-hand testimony challenged every stereotype and prejudice that had justified decades of conflict, offering her community a different perspective on their Apache neighbors. The crowd's reaction was mixed, but largely positive. Many residents had known Sarah since childhood and trusted her judgment implicitly. Her reputation for honesty and practical wisdom gave weight to her testimony about Apache character and intentions. More significantly, several prominent citizens stepped forward to support her account. Jake Harrison, the trading post owner who had dealt with Apache customers for years, confirmed that Apache people were reliable trading partners who honored their agreements and paid their debts faithfully. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the town's physician, added her voice to support Sarah's description of Apache medical knowledge and healing practices. Her professional credibility lent authority to claims about Apache sophistication that many residents had dismissed as impossible. The momentum of support reached a tipping point when Father Miguel Santos, the elderly priest who served the Mexican families in the area, spoke about his own positive encounters with Apache spiritual leaders. His testimony about shared values and common humanity resonated powerfully with the diverse community. Thunderhorse recognized the significance of the moment and made a gesture that would be remembered for generations. He approached Mayor Hendricks with a beautifully crafted silver medallion that bore the seal of Red Cloud Walker's authority. This token grants safe passage through Apache territory to any citizen of Copper Ridge who travels in peace, Thunderhorse explained. It represents Red Cloud Walker's hope that the friendship begun by Sarah Mitchell can grow between our peoples. The medallion was more than a diplomatic gift. It was a practical tool that could protect Copper Ridge residents traveling through Apache territory, while demonstrating Apache commitment to distinguishing between hostile and peaceful intentions. Among white settlers, Mayor Hendricks accepted the token with appropriate ceremony, understanding its significance as both a gesture of respect and a potential foundation for future relationships. His response included an invitation for Apache representatives to visit Copper Ridge as honored guests, establishing a precedent for ongoing diplomatic contact. The formal ceremonies concluded with a feast prepared by the townswomen, who had overcome their initial fears to provide hospitality worthy of the historic occasion. The shared meal became an opportunity for informal cultural exchange, with Apache warriors and Copper Ridge residents discovering common interests and values that transcended their different backgrounds. As evening approached, Thunderhorse announced that the escort would depart at dawn, having successfully completed their mission. The announcement triggered mixed emotions among the townspeople, who had begun to appreciate the rare opportunity to interact with Apache culture in a peaceful context. Sarah spent the evening moving between Apache and settler groups, serving as interpreter and cultural bridge, while processing her own complex emotions about returning to her former life. The experiences of recent days had changed her fundamentally, creating perspectives and responsibilities that would influence every aspect of her future. The most significant moment came when Thunderhorse approached her privately for a final conversation. His words carried the weight of Red Cloud Walker's personal message and the hopes of all Apache people for a different future. "Sister who fights wolves," he said, using her Apache name with familial affection. "You have seen what is possible when courage replaces fear. The seeds planted today may grow into something that benefits both our peoples, but only if there are those willing to tend them carefully." Sarah understood the responsibility he was placing upon her. She had become more than a rescued person or honored guest. She was now a living symbol of the possibility for peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between two cultures that had been locked in conflict for too long. As she prepared for her first night back in her own bed, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of mercy and evolved into something that might change the course of history in the Arizona Territory. Outside her window, the Apache escort maintained their vigil, 60 warriors whose presence in Copper Ridge represented a revolution in thinking about what was possible between their peoples. Tomorrow, they would return to their own world, but the impact of their visit would resonate through the community for generations to come. The success of their mission had exceeded everyone's expectations, proving that courage, respect, and genuine goodwill could overcome seemingly insurmountable barriers. The question now was whether the lessons learned during their remarkable journey could be sustained and built upon in the challenging times ahead. Sarah fell asleep, knowing that her life would never be the same, but confident that the changes she had experienced would ultimately benefit both the Apache people who had honored her and the settler community that had welcomed her home. The bridge between two worlds had been successfully constructed, and she would spend the rest of her life helping others cross it safely. The departure of Thunderhorse and his 60 warriors at dawn marked the beginning of a new chapter in Sarah's life that proved more challenging than anything she had experienced during her time with the Apache. The transformation from honored guest among the Apache to bridge builder in her own community required skills she was still developing, and the expectations placed upon her seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Within a week of the escort's departure, Sarah found herself at the center of a territorial controversy that extended far beyond Copper Ridge. Newspaper editors in Tucson and Phoenix demanded detailed accounts of her experiences, while territorial officials in Prescott summoned her for formal debriefings about Apache capabilities and intentions. The simple act of saving a boy from wolves had evolved into a matter of territorial policy that would influence decisions affecting thousands of lives. The first major test of her new role came when Colonel Harrison Blackwood, commander of the BAD Department of Arizona, arrived in Copper Ridge with a full military escort. His mission was officially described as a routine inspection, but everyone understood he had come specifically to question Sarah about intelligence gathered during her time in Apache territory. Colonel Blackwood was a career soldier whose experience fighting Apache warriors had earned him both respect and frustration. His military mind appreciated Apache tactical skills, while his duty demanded their defeat and removal from ancestral lands. Sarah's account of Apache society challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of the conflict he had been ordered to win. The interrogation took place in the mayor's office, with Sarah facing questions that probed every aspect of her Apache experiences. Colonel Blackwood's inquiries focused particularly on military capabilities, troop strengths, weapons availability, and strategic intentions that might affect future military operations. Sarah found herself walking a diplomatic tightrope, providing honest answers about Apache's strength and organization, while emphasizing their genuine desire for peaceful coexistence when treated with respect. Her responses revealed Apache sophistication that impressed the colonel while challenging his preconceptions about savage opponents incapable of rational negotiation. "Miss Mitchell," Colonel Blackwood said after hours of detailed questioning, "your account suggests these Apache leaders possess strategic thinking that rivals our own military planning. If that's accurate, it changes everything about how we approach this conflict." Sarah's response would be quoted in military reports throughout the territorial command structure. "Colonel, the Apache leaders I met are not the mindless savages described in our newspapers. They're intelligent people fighting for their families and their homeland with whatever means available to them. If we continue treating them as enemies incapable of reason, we'll face generations of warfare that benefits no one." The colonel's reaction revealed the military's growing recognition that current policies were failing to achieve their objectives. Apache resistance was proving more resilient and sophisticated than anticipated, while the costs of continued warfare were becoming politically unsustainable in Washington. More significantly, Sarah's testimony about Apache willingness to honor agreements and maintain peaceful relationships provided potential alternatives to purely military solutions. Her first-hand account of Apache diplomacy offered possibilities that had been dismissed as impossible by previous territorial administrations. Following Colonel Blackwood's departure, Sarah faced increasing pressure from various factions within her own community. Some residents viewed her Apache associations with suspicion, questioning whether her loyalties had been compromised by her experiences. Others saw her as a valuable resource for intelligence about Apache plans and capabilities. The most difficult challenge came from a group of hardline settlers led by Marcus Webb, a rancher whose family had suffered losses during Apache raids. Webb organized meetings designed to pressure Sarah into providing information that could be used against Apache communities, arguing that her duty to her own people outweighed any obligations to Apache friends. Sarah's refusal to betray Apache trust created tensions that threatened to divide the community. Webb's faction accused her of sympathizing with enemies of civilization, while her supporters argued that her Apache connections provided opportunities for peaceful resolution of long-standing conflicts. The controversy reached a crisis point when Webb attempted to organize a vigilante expedition against Apache camps, using Sarah's descriptions of locations and defensive positions to plan attacks on peaceful settlements. His proposal gained support among settlers who had lost family members or property during years of warfare. Sarah's response to Webb's plans required courage that matched her original rescue of Nulnish. She publicly confronted the vigilante organizers, using her detailed knowledge of Apache military capabilities to explain why attacks on their settlements would result in devastating retaliation against all white communities in the territory. Marcus Webb wants to use information I gained as an honored guest to attack people who showed me nothing but kindness and respect, Sarah declared at a packed town meeting. If we betray Apache trust in this way, we'll face a war that will destroy every settlement between here and Mexico. Is revenge worth the lives of our children? Her speech sparked heated debates that revealed deep divisions within the settler community. Some residents supported Webb's call for aggressive action against Apache communities, while others recognized the wisdom of Sarah's warnings about potential consequences. The debate was settled by an unexpected intervention from Captain Stone, who had been quietly monitoring the situation from his military post. His professional assessment of Apache military capabilities supported Sarah's warnings about the consequences of vigilante attacks on Apache settlements. Any unauthorized attacks on Apache camps will be met with retaliation that our military forces cannot prevent, Captain Stone announced. Miss Mitchell's warnings about Apache capabilities are accurate based on our intelligence assessments. Vigilante actions will result in territorial warfare that could spread beyond our ability to contain. Webb's vigilante plans collapsed in the face of military opposition and community recognition of the devastating consequences such actions would trigger. The crisis passed, but Sarah understood that similar challenges would continue as long as tensions remained high between Apache and settler communities. The resolution of the vigilante threat led to Sarah's formal appointment as a territorial liaison for Apache affairs, a position created specifically to utilize her unique relationships and cultural knowledge. The appointment carried both honor and tremendous responsibility, making her the primary contact point between territorial government and Apache leadership. Her first official mission involved traveling to several Apache settlements to assess conditions and gather information about current needs and concerns. The journeys revealed the desperate situation facing many Apache families who were struggling to survive on increasingly restricted territory while maintaining their cultural traditions. Sarah's reports to territorial officials painted a picture of Apache communities under severe stress but determined to preserve their way of life through whatever means necessary. Her recommendations emphasized the need for fair treatment and recognition of legitimate Apache rights to ancestral territories. The most significant development came when Red Cloud Walker sent a formal invitation for Sarah to serve as mediator in peace negotiations between Apache leaders and territorial representatives. The unprecedented proposal offered possibilities for resolving conflicts that had seemed intractable through purely military approaches. Sarah's acceptance of the mediation role marked another transformation in her extraordinary journey. She was no longer simply someone who had performed an act of mercy. She had become a key figure in efforts to establish lasting peace between two peoples who had been locked in conflict for generations. The preparation for peace negotiations required intensive study of both Apache and American legal traditions, treaty precedents, and the complex web of territorial politics that would influence any potential agreements. Sarah immersed herself in learning about issues ranging from land rights to trading relationships to cultural preservation. Her efforts were supported by unlikely allies from both communities. Apache leaders provided detailed instruction in their diplomatic traditions and decision-making processes, while progressive settlers contributed knowledge about American legal systems and political realities that would affect any negotiated settlements. The breakthrough came when Sarah proposed a series of preliminary meetings between small groups of Apache and settler representatives designed to build trust and understanding before attempting formal negotiations. These informal gatherings allowed both sides to discover common interests and shared values that had been obscured by years of conflict. The success of these preliminary meetings led to growing support for comprehensive peace negotiations that could address the root causes of Apache settler conflicts. Sarah's role as mediator placed her at the center of historic discussions that would determine the future of the Arizona Territory. As winter approached, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her life since that morning when she had heard wolves howling in a distant canyon. The simple decision to help a boy in danger had led to experiences and responsibilities she could never have imagined. Her Apache name, Sister Who Fights Wolves, had taken on new meaning as she fought different kinds of wolves, the prejudice, fear, and misunderstanding that prevented two peoples from finding peaceful coexistence. The battles she now fought were waged with words and understanding rather than weapons, but they required no less courage than her original confrontation with the wolf pack. The approaching negotiations would test everything she had learned about both Apache and settler cultures, challenging her to find solutions that honored the legitimate needs and concerns of both peoples. Success would require wisdom that transcended her individual experience, drawing on the collective hopes of all, who yearned for an end to the cycle of violence and revenge. Sarah understood that her unique position carried the weight of history. The agreements reached through her mediation could establish precedents that influenced Native American relations throughout the American West. The responsibility was overwhelming, but her experiences had taught her that extraordinary circumstances sometimes required ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. As she prepared for the challenges ahead, Sarah drew strength from the memory of Nalnish's courage during his ordeal with the wolves. The young Apache boy had faced death with dignity and determination, never losing hope that rescue might come from an unexpected source. Now Sarah faced her own test of courage and determination, knowing that the future of two peoples might depend on her ability to bridge differences that had seemed impossible to overcome. The wolves she now fought were more dangerous than those that had threatened Nalnish, but her commitment to justice and peace gave her the strength to continue the battle. The historic peace negotiations convened on neutral ground at Eagles Rest, a remote mesa that held spiritual significance for Apache people while offering strategic advantages that satisfied military security concerns. The location had been chosen after weeks of careful diplomacy, representing the first time in territorial history that Apache leaders and American officials would meet as equals rather than conquerors and conquered. Sarah arrived 3 days before. The formal proceedings to oversee final preparations and mediate last-minute disputes about protocols and procedures. The complexity of organizing such an unprecedented gathering had challenged everyone involved, requiring solutions to problems that had never been encountered in previous territorial negotiations. The physical arrangements alone reflected the delicate balance required for success. Apache traditions demanded that negotiations take place under open sky with sacred directions honored in seating arrangements, while American officials required formal documentation and legal procedures that seemed foreign to Apache decision-making processes. Sarah worked tirelessly to bridge these cultural differences, creating hybrid protocols that respected both traditions while enabling productive discussions. Her solution involved organizing the negotiations in a large circle that honored Apache customs while maintaining formal record-keeping that satisfied American legal requirements. Red Cloud Walker arrived with a delegation that represented the most comprehensive gathering of Apache leadership in decades. Chiefs from distant bands who rarely cooperated had put aside territorial disputes and personal grievances to participate in negotiations that could determine their people's survival in an increasingly hostile world. The American delegation was equally impressive, including territorial officials, military commanders, federal representatives, and influential civilians whose support would be crucial for implementing any agreements reached during the negotiations. Sarah recognized that the political careers of several participants would be determined by the success or failure of these unprecedented talks. The opening ceremonies revealed the profound cultural gulf that negotiations would need to bridge. Apache traditions required elaborate rituals, acknowledging the spiritual significance of the gathering, while American customs emphasized formal speeches and legal procedures that seemed mundane by comparison. Sarah's role as cultural interpreter became crucial during these early stages, helping each side understand the deeper meanings behind the other's ceremonial requirements. Her explanations helped American officials appreciate that Apache rituals were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated diplomatic traditions with practical purposes. The first substantive discussions focused on territorial boundaries, an issue that revealed fundamental differences in how Apache and American cultures understood land ownership and usage rights. American concepts of individual property ownership clashed with Apache traditions of collective stewardship and seasonal migration patterns. Sarah facilitated these discussions by helping both sides recognize valid concerns underlying their different approaches to land use. Apache needs for access to traditional hunting grounds and sacred sites were not incompatible with American desires for settled agriculture and mining operations, provided both communities were willing to cooperate rather than compete. The breakthrough came when Sarah proposed a revolutionary concept that had never been attempted in American-Indian relations. Instead of forcing Apache people onto distant reservations, she suggested creating shared territories where both communities could coexist while maintaining their distinct cultural practices and economic activities. The proposal required detailed negotiations about specific boundaries, seasonal usage rights, and procedures for resolving conflicts that would inevitably arise between neighbors with different customs and priorities. Sarah's intimate knowledge of both cultures proved invaluable in crafting agreements that protected essential interests of both communities. Red Cloud Walker's response to the shared territory proposal revealed the sophisticated political thinking that characterized Apache leadership. He recognized that coexistence offered better long-term prospects for Apache survival than continued warfare, but demanded guarantees that agreements would be honored rather than abandoned when circumstances changed. The chief's concerns were based on bitter experience with previous treaties that had been broken whenever American interests changed, or new discoveries of gold and silver created pressure for additional territorial concessions. Apache leaders had learned to be skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true. Sarah addressed these concerns by proposing innovative enforcement mechanisms that gave both communities stakes in maintaining peaceful relationships. Violation of agreements by either side would trigger automatic mediation procedures and economic penalties that made cooperation more profitable than conflict. The most contentious issue involved questions of justice and law enforcement in shared territories. American officials demanded that Apache people be subject to territorial courts and legal procedures, while Apache leaders insisted on maintaining traditional justice systems that had governed their communities for generations. Sarah's solution involved creating parallel legal systems that handled different types of cases according to cultural traditions, with joint tribunals resolving disputes between Apache and American citizens. The compromise required extensive negotiations about jurisdictional boundaries and appeal procedures, but offered practical solutions that respected both legal traditions. The negotiations were complicated by external pressures from groups opposed to any peaceful settlement. Military contractors who profited from ongoing warfare lobbied against agreements that would reduce demand for weapons and supplies, while some settlers demanded complete Apache removal regardless of negotiated settlements. More dangerous were Apache factions that viewed negotiations as betrayal of traditional resistance to American expansion. Younger warriors who had gained status through military success were reluctant to accept peaceful solutions that would reduce their influence within Apache society. Sarah found herself mediating not only between Apache and American delegations, but also within both communities, helping moderate leaders overcome opposition from extremists who preferred continued conflict to compromise solutions. Her efforts required diplomatic skills that had been developed through months of experience navigating complex cultural and political relationships. The turning point came during the fourth week of negotiations, when news arrived that Apache raiders had attacked a settlement near Tombstone, killing several families and taking captives. The incident threatened to destroy everything that had been accomplished during weeks of patient diplomacy and careful compromise. American officials demanded immediate action against the raiders, while Apache leaders insisted the attacks had been conducted by renegade bands that operated outside their authority. The crisis tested whether the negotiated agreements were strong enough to survive the kind of incidents that had previously triggered cycles of revenge and retaliation. Sarah's response to the crisis demonstrated the wisdom gained through her extraordinary experiences. Instead of allowing the incident to derail negotiations, she proposed using it as a test case for the conflict resolution mechanisms that had been developed during the peace talks. Working with both delegations, Sarah organized a joint investigation that revealed the attacks had indeed been conducted by a renegade Apache band that had been raiding both American settlements and peaceful Apache camps. The discovery created opportunities for cooperation against common enemies rather than renewed warfare between the negotiating parties. The joint response to the Tombstone crisis became a model for future cooperation, with Apache warriors and American soldiers working together to track down the renegade band and rescue captives. The success of this cooperation provided concrete evidence that former enemies could become effective allies when their interests aligned. Red Cloud Walker's decision to provide Apache warriors for the joint expedition required tremendous political courage, as it meant fighting against other Apache people in alliance with traditional enemies. His commitment to the peace process demonstrated leadership that impressed even skeptical American officials. The capture of the renegade leader and rescue of captives marked a triumph for the negotiated agreements, proving that peaceful cooperation could achieve results that neither side could accomplish alone. The success generated momentum that carried the negotiations through remaining obstacles to final agreement. The treaty signing ceremony combined elements from both cultures in a celebration that honored the spiritual significance of the achievement while creating legal documents that would guide future relationships. Sarah's role in the ceremony reflected her unique position as the catalyst who had made such unprecedented cooperation possible. Red Cloud Walker's speech during the signing ceremony acknowledged Sarah's crucial contributions while challenging both communities to build on the foundation that had been established through months of patient negotiation and mutual learning. Sister Who Fights Wolves has shown us that courage comes in many forms, the great chief declared. Today we sign papers that promise peace, but tomorrow we must have the courage to live as neighbors rather than enemies. The wolves we must fight now are the fear and hatred that live in our own hearts. The American response, delivered by Territorial Governor Nathan Mills, emphasized the historic significance of agreements that established new precedents for relations between Indian nations and American territories. The governor's recognition of Apache sovereignty and cultural rights marked a dramatic departure from previous policies of forced assimilation and removal. As the formal ceremonies concluded and delegates prepared to return to their communities, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of mercy and evolved into historic achievements that would influence the American West for generations to come. The signed treaties represented more than diplomatic success. They embodied proof that cooperation and mutual respect could overcome seemingly insurmountable differences between peoples with conflicting interests and incompatible worldviews. The agreements would be tested by future challenges, but the precedent had been established. Sarah's transformation from unknown horse trader to respected diplomat illustrated the potential for ordinary individuals to achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demanded courage and wisdom. Her Apache name had proven prophetic. She had indeed fought wolves, though the most dangerous had proven to be the prejudice and fear that prevented people from recognizing their common humanity. The success of the Eagle's Rest negotiations would inspire similar efforts throughout the American West, as other territories struggled with their own conflicts between expanding American settlement and indigenous resistance. Sarah's mediation techniques would be studied and adapted for use in other negotiations, spreading the influence of her achievements far beyond the Arizona territory. As she prepared to return to Copper Ridge, Sarah understood that her work was far from finished. The agreements reached at Eagle's Rest would require constant attention and periodic renewal as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. Her role as mediator between two worlds had become a lifetime commitment that would define the remainder of her extraordinary life. 5 years after the signing of the Eagle's Rest treaties, Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch of her expanded ranch house, watching as Apache and American children played together in the meadow below. The sight would have been unthinkable during her youth, yet it had become commonplace in the shared territories that now dotted the Arizona landscape like islands of hope in what had once been an ocean of conflict. The success of the peace agreements had exceeded everyone's expectations, transforming the territory from a battleground into a model of cooperation that attracted attention from government officials and scholars throughout the nation. Delegations from other territories regularly visited to study the innovative approaches that had made such remarkable cooperation possible. Sarah's role had evolved far beyond her original function as mediator. She now served as Director of Intercultural Affairs for the territory, overseeing programs that facilitated cooperation between Apache and American communities, while preserving the distinct cultural identities that made each group unique and valuable. The position required constant travel between settlements, Apache camps, and territorial offices, monitoring the implementation of treaty provisions while addressing problems that arose as two very different peoples learned to live as neighbors. Each challenge required creative solutions that honored both legal obligations and cultural sensitivities. One of Sarah's most successful innovations was the establishment of trading partnerships that benefited both communities while creating economic incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships. Apache artisans found eager markets for their sophisticated metalwork and textiles among American settlers, while Apache communities gained access to manufactured goods and agricultural products that improved their quality of life. The educational exchanges had proven equally valuable. Apache children learned English and arithmetic that would help them navigate an increasingly complex world, while American students studied traditional Apache knowledge about desert survival, herbal medicine, and sustainable land management that proved invaluable for frontier life. Sarah's greatest pride was the joint Apache-American school that had been established in Copper Ridge, where children from both communities learned together while maintaining their distinct cultural traditions. The school had become a symbol of the possibilities that emerged when cooperation replaced conflict. The success story was not without its challenges. Conservative factions in both communities continued to oppose integration, arguing that cultural purity required separation and that cooperation would lead to the loss of traditional values. Sarah found herself regularly mediating disputes between progressives who embraced change and traditionalists who feared it. The most serious crisis had occurred 3 years earlier, when a drought devastated crops throughout the territory and created competition for scarce water resources. Some voices called for abandoning the shared territory agreements and returning to the old system of Apache removal to distant reservations. Sarah's response had demonstrated the diplomatic skills she had developed through years of cross-cultural mediation. Working with leaders from both communities, she organized cooperative water management programs that shared resources equitably while implementing conservation measures that benefited everyone. The drought crisis had actually strengthened the peace agreements by proving their value during difficult times. Apache knowledge of desert water sources had been crucial for community survival, while American engineering expertise had improved water storage and distribution systems that served both populations. The resolution of the water crisis had led to Sarah's appointment to the Territorial Council, making her the first woman to serve in such a position, and recognition of her unique qualifications for addressing complex intercultural issues. Her presence on the council ensured that Apache perspectives would be considered in all territorial policy decisions. During her tenure on the council, Sarah had championed legislation that protected Apache land rights while encouraging economic development that benefited both communities. Her balanced approach had earned respect from colleagues who had initially been skeptical of female participation in territorial governance. The most significant legislative achievement had been the passage of the Cultural Preservation Act, which protected traditional Apache sacred sites while allowing controlled access for American researchers and visitors. The law had become a model for similar legislation in other territories facing comparable cultural conflicts. Sarah's personal life had also been transformed by her extraordinary experiences. 3 years earlier, she had married Dr. James Harrison, the territorial physician who had been instrumental in establishing medical cooperation between Apache healers and American doctors. Their marriage symbolized the kind of partnership that had become possible through mutual respect and understanding. Dr. Harrison's medical practice had benefited enormously from collaboration with Apache healers, whose knowledge of desert plants and traditional treatments had proven remarkably effective for many conditions. The integration of traditional and modern medical approaches had improved healthcare outcomes for both communities. The couple's home had become an informal center for intercultural activities, hosting regular gatherings where Apache and American families shared meals, stories, and celebrations. These social events had played a crucial role in breaking down barriers and building friendships that transcended cultural boundaries. Sarah's relationship with Nile Nish had continued to evolve. As the young Apache leader matured into his role as Red Cloud Walker's designated successor. Now 18 years old, Nile Nish had become a respected voice for cooperation and modernization within Apache society, while maintaining deep connections to traditional values. Nile Nish's education had included time at Eastern universities, where he studied law and political science that prepared him for leadership in an increasingly complex world. His unique background made him an effective advocate for Apache interests in negotiations with territorial and federal officials. The young leader's visits to Sarah's home were always occasions for celebration, bringing together friends from both communities who had watched him grow from the frightened boy trapped by wolves into a confident leader who embodied the best hopes for Apache survival and prosperity. During his most recent visit, Naalnish had shared exciting news about plans for establishing an Apache college that would combine traditional knowledge with modern academic subjects. The institution would serve students from throughout the Southwest, while preserving cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost to assimilation pressures. Sarah's support for the college project reflected her understanding that education was crucial for ensuring that future generations could maintain their cultural identities while adapting to changing circumstances. The school would provide Apache young people with tools for success in the modern world without requiring them to abandon their heritage. The college plans had received enthusiastic support from territorial officials who recognized that educated Apache leaders would be valuable partners in addressing the complex challenges facing the region. Federal funding had been secured based on the success of previous educational cooperation programs. Red Cloud Walker, now in his 70s, had remained a powerful force for peace despite challenges from younger warriors who advocated for more aggressive resistance to American expansion. His wisdom and authority had been crucial for maintaining Apache unity behind the cooperative policies that had brought such remarkable benefits. The old chief's health had begun to decline, making the question of succession increasingly important for the future of Apache-American relations. Naalnish's preparation for leadership had been carefully managed to ensure continuity of the policies that had brought prosperity and peace to both communities. Sarah's role in Naalnish's development had created a unique bond that transcended the normal boundaries between cultures and generations. Their relationship represented living proof that understanding and cooperation could overcome the deepest divisions between peoples with conflicting histories and incompatible worldviews. The success of the Arizona experiment had attracted national attention, with politicians and scholars from throughout the country studying the innovative approaches that had transformed conflict into cooperation. Sarah found herself frequently called to Washington to testify before congressional committees about the lessons learned from intercultural mediation. Her testimony had influenced federal Indian policy in ways that extended far beyond the Arizona territory. Other regions were adopting modified versions of the shared territory concept, while Sarah's mediation techniques were being taught at universities and government training programs. The recognition of her achievements had brought speaking invitations from across the nation, with women's organizations particularly interested in her perspective on female leadership in traditionally male-dominated fields. Sarah's success had inspired other women to pursue careers in diplomacy and public service. Despite the national recognition, Sarah remained committed to the day-to-day work of maintaining and improving the relationships that had been built through years of patient effort. She understood that the cooperation achieved in Arizona required constant attention and periodic renewal to survive changing circumstances and new challenges. The approaching 20th anniversary of her rescue of Naalnish from the wolf pack had prompted reflection on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from an unknown horse trader into a nationally recognized diplomat and pioneer of intercultural cooperation. The anniversary celebration being planned would bring together hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by the events set in motion on that fateful morning in the canyon. The gathering would serve as both commemoration and renewal of commitments to the principles that had made such remarkable cooperation possible. Sarah's preparations for the anniversary celebration included developing new initiatives that would carry the work of intercultural cooperation into the next generation. Plans were underway for expanded educational exchanges, joint economic development projects, and cultural preservation programs that would ensure the achievements of the past. 2 decades would not be lost to future conflicts. As she watched the mixed group of children playing in the meadow, Sarah reflected on the profound truth that had emerged from her extraordinary experiences. The most dangerous wolves were not the predators that threatened individual lives, but the fear and hatred that prevented people from recognizing their common humanity and shared hopes for the future. The work of fighting those wolves would never be finished, requiring each generation to choose cooperation over conflict and understanding over prejudice. Sarah's legacy would not be the specific agreements she had helped negotiate, but the proof that such choices were possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. The sound of laughter from the playing children reminded her that the future belonged to those who had grown up knowing that former enemies could become trusted friends. Their innocent acceptance of diversity and cooperation offered hope that the work begun by their parents would continue and flourish in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. 20 years to the day after Sarah Mitchell first heard the haunting calls of wolves echoing through a distant canyon, she stood before the largest gathering in Arizona Territory history. Representatives from every Apache band, settlers from dozens of communities, territorial officials, federal dignitaries, and international observers had come to commemorate an anniversary that marked far more than a simple rescue. It celebrated the transformation of an entire region from battlefield to beacon of hope. The celebration took place at Monument Valley, chosen for its spiritual significance to Apache people and its breathtaking beauty that symbolized the harmony now possible between human communities and the natural world. A permanent memorial had been erected there, not to war or conquest, but to the power of courage and compassion to overcome seemingly insurmountable divisions. Sarah approached the speaker's platform with a mixture of humility and pride, accompanied by Nalnish, now chief of the United Apache Confederation, and her husband Dr. James Harrison. Behind them walked Red Cloud Walker, now 83 years old, but still commanding respect as the elder statesman who had risked everything to pursue peace instead of endless war. The assembled crowd represented a living testament to the changes that had swept across the territory. Apache and American families sat together, their children switching effortlessly between languages and cultural traditions that had once seemed irreconcilably different. Young people who had grown up in integrated communities looked puzzled when older speakers referred to the time when their peoples had been enemies. Governor Samuel Morrison opened the ceremonies with remarks that would be quoted in newspapers across the nation. His speech acknowledged that the Arizona Territory had become a laboratory for democracy, proving that American ideals of equality and justice could be extended beyond racial and cultural boundaries that other regions still considered insurmountable. 20 years ago, a single act of courage changed the course of history in our territory, Governor Morrison declared. Today we celebrate not just Sarah Mitchell's bravery, but the wisdom of leaders on both sides who chose to build bridges instead of walls, to seek understanding instead of victory. The governor's words were followed by Red Cloud Walker's final public address, delivered in both Apache and English, with the dignified eloquence that had made him one of the most respected leaders in the American West. Though his body showed the effects of advanced age, his voice carried the same authority that had commanded attention in war councils and peace negotiations throughout his remarkable life. "My friends," the old chief began, his weathered hands gesturing toward the mixed crowd before him. "When I was young, our prophets spoke of a time when different peoples would learn to walk together on the same path. I did not expect to live to see that prophecy fulfilled, but here you sit, proving that the Spirit's vision was true. Red Cloud Walker's speech recounted the journey from conflict to cooperation, acknowledging the courage required from leaders in both communities who had been willing to trust former enemies and embrace unprecedented solutions to age-old problems. His words carried special poignancy, as everyone present understood this would likely be his final major public appearance. "Sister who fights wolves," he said, using Sarah's Apache name with the affection of family, "saved more than my grandsons. Life that day in the canyon. She saved the future of all our children by showing us that the greatest strength comes not from defeating our enemies, but from transforming them into friends." The chief's designation of Sarah as his spiritual daughter in Apache tradition marked an honor that would be remembered in tribal histories for generations. The formal adoption ceremony that followed created bonds that transcended biological family, making Sarah a permanent part of Apache heritage while maintaining her identity as a bridge between worlds. Nalnish's address to the gathering demonstrated the leadership qualities that had made him an effective successor to his grandfather's legacy. At 28, he embodied the best possibilities of intercultural cooperation. Thoroughly educated in both Apache traditions and modern academic subjects, equally comfortable in tribal councils and territorial legislative sessions. 20. "Years ago, wolves threatened to end my life," Nalnish told the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the vast amphitheater. "Today, I stand before you as living proof that acts of courage and compassion can multiply beyond anything we might imagine. The wolves we must fight now are not the four-legged hunters of the desert, but the fears and prejudices that still divide people in other places." The young chief's words acknowledged that the Arizona success story remained unique in a nation still struggling with racial conflicts and cultural divisions. Other territories and states were beginning to adopt modified versions of the Arizona model, but progress was slow and often met with violent resistance from those who profited from maintaining hatred and division. Sarah's keynote address represented the culmination of 2 decades of experience, bridging cultural differences and mediating complex negotiations. Her words would be published in books and quoted in diplomatic schools throughout the world, establishing principles for intercultural cooperation that would influence international relations for generations to come. "I often wonder what would have happened if I had chosen differently that morning 20 years ago," Sarah began, her voice reflecting the wisdom gained through extraordinary experiences. "What if I had decided the risk was too great, or the boy was not my responsibility? The answer is that none of you would be here today, because the future we celebrate was created by countless choices made by countless people who chose courage over fear, understanding over prejudice." Her speech outlined the practical lessons learned through 2 decades of intercultural mediation, emphasizing that successful cooperation required genuine respect for cultural differences rather than attempts to eliminate or minimize them. The Arizona model worked because it celebrated diversity while creating shared institutions that served everyone's interests. "The secret is not trying to make everyone the same," Sarah explained, "but finding ways for different peoples to complement each other's strengths while supporting each other's aspirations. Apache knowledge of the desert has made American settlements more sustainable, while American technology has improved Apache quality of life. Neither community had to abandon its identity to benefit from cooperation." The ceremony's most moving moment came when children from the integrated schools performed traditional songs and dances from both cultures, their innocent enthusiasm demonstrating how naturally cooperation could develop when people grew up without inherited prejudices. The performance brought tears to many eyes as older attendees remembered the hatred and fear that had once made such scenes impossible to imagine. The unveiling of the permanent memorial marked the ceremony's climactic moment. The monument featured bronze sculptures of Sarah, Nalnish, and Red Cloud Walker, surrounded by symbolic representations of wolves, mountains, and flying eagles that honored both Apache spiritual traditions and American artistic conventions. The memorial's inscription, composed jointly by Apache and American writers, captured the essential message that the anniversary celebration was meant to convey: in memory of courage that conquered fear, wisdom that overcame hatred, and love that transformed enemies into family. May future generations remember that the greatest victories are won not through force of arms, but through strength of heart. The dedication was followed by the announcement of the Sarah Mitchell Institute for Intercultural Studies, an academic center that would train diplomats, teachers, and community leaders in the techniques of cross-cultural mediation and cooperation. The institute would be funded jointly by federal appropriations and tribal contributions, symbolizing the partnership that had made Arizona's transformation possible. International observers at the ceremony included representatives from Canada, Mexico, and several European nations that were struggling with their own cultural conflicts and indigenous rights issues. Their presence indicated that the Arizona model was being studied as a potential solution for intercultural problems throughout the world. The most significant announcement came from President Chester Arthur himself, who had traveled to Arizona specifically to participate in the anniversary celebration. His presidential proclamation designated the Arizona Territory as a special administrative zone for intercultural cooperation, providing federal protection and funding for the innovative programs that had achieved such remarkable success. The Arizona Territory has proven that American democracy can embrace diversity while maintaining unity, President Arthur declared. The principles demonstrated here will guide our nation's approach to cultural differences and indigenous relations. As we continue expanding westward, the presidential endorsement ensured that the Arizona model would be protected from political changes and economic pressures that might otherwise threaten its continued success. Federal recognition also opened possibilities for expanding similar programs to other regions, where cultural conflicts continued to generate violence and suffering. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by old friends and new admirers who wanted to express their gratitude for her role in creating the remarkable community they had all witnessed. Children who had grown up in integrated schools brought their own children to meet the woman whose courage had made their peaceful world possible. The personal conversations that followed the public ceremonies revealed the depth of transformation that had occurred throughout the territory. Former enemies spoke of business partnerships and family friendships that had enriched their lives in ways they had never expected. Apache and American veterans of the old conflicts shared stories of how their children and grandchildren had become living symbols of reconciliation and hope. Red Cloud Walker approached Sarah for a private farewell that both understood might be their last. The old chief's hands were steady as he placed a final gift in her care, a medicine bundle that had been passed down through generations of Apache leaders, now entrusted to someone whose spiritual connection to the tribe transcended biological heritage. "Granddaughter," he said, using the family term that reflected their adopted relationship, "you have fought the wolves of hatred and fear with weapons they could not resist, courage and love. The battle is not finished, but you have shown others how victory can be achieved." As evening settled over Monument Valley and the last visitors departed for their distant homes, Sarah stood with her husband and adopted son, watching the sun set over a landscape that no longer divided peoples but united them in shared appreciation for its beauty and spiritual significance. The memorial would stand as permanent testimony to the power of individual courage to create social transformation while the living communities throughout Arizona would continue demonstrating that cooperation and mutual respect could overcome the deepest divisions between different peoples and cultures. Sarah's journey from unknown horse trader to internationally recognized diplomat had proven that extraordinary circumstances sometimes called forth extraordinary capabilities from the most unlikely sources. Her legacy would not be measured in treaties signed or awards received, but in the generations of children who would grow up knowing that former enemies could become beloved family. The wolves had been defeated, not through violence, but through the greater strength of human compassion and understanding. The battle would continue in other places and other times, but Arizona had shown the world that victory was possible for those with courage enough to choose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and cooperation over conflict. As stars appeared in the desert sky above Monument Valley, Sarah reflected on the truth that had guided her through 20 years of intercultural mediation. The most dangerous predators were not the wolves that threatened individual lives, but the fear and hatred that prevented people from recognizing their common humanity and shared dreams for their children's future. The anniversary celebration had ended, but the work of building bridges between different worlds would continue for as long as human courage and compassion proved stronger than the forces that sought to divide people from each other. In Arizona territory at least, the wolves of hatred had been conquered by something more powerful than any weapon: the simple recognition that all children deserved to grow up in a world where diversity was celebrated rather than feared. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.